thanks so much, everyone. As promised, I'm going to go ahead and welcome everyone to CSIS once again. Welcome to the people in the room. Welcome to our online audience talking today at our conference on sustaining access. For our final session of the day, we have a great conversation coming up, an important one. Thinking back to this morning, first of all, this conference is situated in the context of CSIS's work on the Task Force on Humanitarian Access, and so we're very lucky to have with us to moderate our next session, Dr. Michael Van Rooyen, who was a member of our task force in 2019. Dr. Van Rooyen is a director and founder of Harvard's Humanitarian Initiative. He's also chairman of emergency medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital. This conversation also picks up on some of the themes that we talked about in our first plenary session. We talked about counterterrorism and navigating counterterrorism exemptions, but placed it in the context of a changing world and conversations about strategic competition and great power competition. And so we're very grateful for our panelists and for Dr. Van Rooyen for moderating this conversation on humanitarian access and the challenges of humanitarian access within the context of great power competition and learning the lessons from the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So Dr. Van Rooyen, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our colleagues at CSIS and NRC for hosting this event, and for my wonderful panelists, both remote and in person, to talk about these issues of access in Ukraine. I want to put one slide up if I got it. And this will not be a slideshow, but I just want to start out by giving a little bit of a few framing remarks, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll navigate through a few questions, and then we'll open it up for questions as we go. So thank you again. So the issue of humanitarian access in Ukraine is a major and important issue, as we know, and I'll just reorient you. There's 44 million people in Ukraine that have been affected by war and conflict, 18 million requiring urgent humanitarian aid. Over the course of the Russian invasion over the last, 14 months now, we've seen the largest refugee and IDP movement since the partition of India, actually, with 8 million people crossing international borders and 5 million people internally displaced in Ukraine. We've also seen a rising death toll, anywhere from, and it's very difficult to count, anywhere from 10 to 100,000 civilian deaths, and innumerable deaths actually to deprivation, which we can't even really measure at the moment. There's also the forcible transfer of over 1.6 million Ukrainians into Russian territory. Russian military officials will say that this is a repatriation. The rest of the world calls it a war crime. And so by moving people and forcing displacement and repatriation, this has been a major feature of this war as well. Civilian attacks and direct civilian threats and direct targeting of civilian facilities has also been a major feature of this conflict. So we have seen direct targeting of schools, hospitals, civilian apartment buildings, and areas that have no major sort of military significance, but actually directly terrorize civilians. These are most intense in the Donbass region and eastern Ukraine, but also in the southern area as well. And finally, there's the use of inappropriate munitions and landmines that have really restricted humanitarian access. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is the issue of access and the sort of restrictions in humanitarian corridors, the restrictions in access, the direct attacks on aid convoys, the overall restrictions in accessing populations in a variety of other areas, and the impacts of that as well. So we'll talk about that. And I want to end with, there's been a Ukraine advocacy working group that has put forth a year into the war, a series of statements that really call for the respect for humanitarian norms and laws and proportionality. They've also called for to respect and promote the 2023 response plan, advocate for access, scale funding, particularly for local organizations, and advancing localization, which we all believe is really important in our field, doubling down on protection and looking for durable solutions. And you can see that declaration in a variety. It was released in a press release in February of 2023, and you can see that online. So with that, and I put the slide up just to give you a heat map of sort of the areas that we're talking about that have the most intense restrictions in access. Those in darkest red are the areas that are the most complicated by access. The details here are less important. The bigger, I mean, at least for the purposes of this panel, but we will talk about actually why this is and what are the implications and what are the sort of ramifications. So I'd like to introduce my panelists. You can take the slide down if you don't mind. And we'll start out with a couple of our panelists. I'm really delighted to have experts who think about this stuff and these issues and can actually comment on their organizational practices as well. And I'll start with Katya Shamraj, who is on, there she is, good. So welcome, Katya. And I'll introduce them briefly. You can read their bios as well, but I'll keep this brief so we can get to the heart of the conversation. Katya is the program director for HIAS, the humanitarian NGO that is focused on mental health, women and girls empowerment, and cash assistance. And she's been on the ground and working in Ukraine for a year now. She has a background in sort of multi-sectoral consulting, including building partnerships with private industry as well. And she's worked across many areas in the Middle East and throughout Africa. Johnny Robinson, welcome. Johnny is a humanitarian specialist at the U.S. Naval War College. He's a global fellow at the Brown University Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. And he's spent 10 years or more living abroad and working in conflicted environments in the Middle East. He served as a researcher in the Carter Center's Syria Conflict Resolution and has really advanced areas of research, specifically looking at the power struggles promoted by Russia and China as well. And so he's really served as both an in-field expert and also a researcher. So welcome. Thanks for coming. And then finally, Mans Wielander. So Mans is a humanitarian professional with a background in protection. He's the humanitarian access manager of the, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and we're thrilled to have him here as well. He's had a lot of experience with NRC and Save the Children as well. He's was part of the team to establish the Nonviolent Peace Force in the New Country Mission in Iraq and served in many frontline areas. He's also served as an intelligence officer for the Swedish Amphibious Corps and for CEDA, as well as many other roles. So welcome and great to have you as well. We're going to target some of the questions to the expertise of our panelists. And so I'm going to start us off by asking each of the panelists to give us some opening remarks. We're aiming for a few minutes of opening remarks, but with a focus on the particular first question at hand, which is, what progress has been made in the opening and maintaining of humanitarian corridors in eastern and southern Ukraine? What are the primary barriers, and what is your organization and your sort of research showing us? So I'll start out with Mans and get your opinions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. My mic is on. Might take a little bit more than 2 minutes, but you'll have to stop me if I take too long. Because indeed, humanitarian corridors in Ukraine has been, there's been a lot of talks about the corridors, though we've seen very mixed results. In fact, we've rarely seen the corridors that has been implemented to actually provide the safety and guaranteed safe passage that we would like to see. I just kind of want to say, the very foundation of humanitarian corridors is based on two basic requirements. One is engagement between the parties to the conflict, i.e. diplomatic relationships, and then practical commitments to IHL. Of course, you also need then some logistical arrangements, the timing of a ceasefire, this precise location of the safe passage, and so on. But at the end of the day, it comes down to trust and the fact that these arrangements then are respected. I think we all remember the early days of 24th Feb and the early days of March, when I think was the first time we started to see the images from the negotiations teams between Ukraine and Russia that was taking place in Belarus. And as a result of those talks, there was an agreement to start implementing humanitarian corridors from the major cities of Ukraine, where that was contested at the time. They were executed with extreme difficulty. They were repeatedly shelled. There was one particular from Mariupol that was agreed upon that was turned out to be mined. I do want to be a little bit careful bringing too much examples because there are many, they're well documented. Most of them sort of invite you to question whether or not these attacks were deliberate and violations of IHL. But either way, we saw many of them, and there was particularly one that was damaging to us as international humanitarian actors as well, who were operating at the time a little bit further down the displacement corridors. And that was an incident in Kramatorsk in early May, when a cluster bomb, potentially 2 cluster bombs, hit a railway station where thousands of civilians were waiting for the evacuation trains, and 50 people killed. And so naturally, these incidents that happened very early on in conflict completely eroded the trust that would have to be the foundation for any future sort of possibilities of further corridors on other agreements on humanitarian access and so on. Of course, also that's to say that there was hundreds and thousands, potentially millions of people who were actually able to evacuate and get to a safe space as a result of these corridors. But this was really only made possible by the sort of relentless bravery of Ukrainian civil society actors, authorities, the police, state emergency services, military and territorial defense services as well, to basically, in a very desperate measure, trying to get people out of danger, as opposed to any well-coordinated and respected arrangement. I could be wrong, but my impression is that there were very few international actors involved in those evacuations and corridors at the time. A little bit later, in early April, we saw a very high-profile one, though, where ICRC and the United Nations had arranged for evacuations of about 400 civilians out of bunkers in the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol, which was, unfortunately, as much as I would say it was probably a success of humanitarian diplomacy, and I believe it was a direct engagement between the Secretary General and President Putin, and then it trickled down from there. But unfortunately, it was a one-off. And it was not possible to replicate further on. Of course, we've also seen other types of movements of civilian populations, of supplies, other than through the mechanism of humanitarian corridors. As much as we equally see that kind of activities in the early outset of the crisis, as much as we still see it today. The main mechanism being the local responders that are still evacuating people from hotspots in Bakhmut and in Avdiivka and so on, at high risk for their own lives. We, as the international sort of humanitarian community, has also started to catch up a little bit and provide a bit more well-coordinated and effective programming closer to the front lines and provide that complementarity and working alongside with local actors. I think one of the main examples worth mentioning is the interagency convoys that UNOCHA is coordinating to provide and enable large quantities of supplies to the most high-risk areas. Besides that, we've also had 3 crossing points throughout this past year plus along the front line. We had one that kind of evaporated up in Kharkiv after the counteroffensive in September. There was another one between Kherson and Kryvyi that also disappeared actually before the Russian withdrawal from Kherson region because of a number of security incidents, including, for instance, one civilian convoy that was leaving the Russia-controlled territories and that was shelled with a large number of casualties. There was another one on the 3rd crossing point in Zaporizhia where a missile struck a transit point, or sort of an assembly point where civilians were waiting to evacuate. And so these crossings eventually disappeared, and the last one down in Zaporizhzhia was closed since December. And these were important supply lines for the little humanitarian aid that was able to cross from Ukraine government-controlled areas into Russia-controlled territories in small quantities by local actors, those that were brave enough to venture across, because they also did that at high risk for their own lives. There was very little, if any, international movements across those crossing points. It was simply just not possible. There has also not been any other cross line, as in across the front line, movement of supplies or humanitarian personnel throughout the war. That's not to say that there has not been attempts. There's been plenty of attempts, including from and through the humanitarian notification system that the United Nations is utilizing to notify both parties to the conflict on their movements. And every time those particular notifications have been rejected by Russia to allow for movements across the front line.
Mans, I'm going to ask you to give me your top points now, and so I can move around the other folks and then get to some of those when we get there. So thank you.
All right, so I think my point was to say that we don't have access to all of the territory of Ukraine. Also, on a sort of field level, there is no scope for frontline negotiations. Anyone who spent a minute or two in a few kilometers within the front line knows that there is no dialogue and negotiations to happen on the front line. And so we do wait, we do expect, we do hope for a high-level negotiations. We've called for those, as you mentioned, the declaration was called for a number of efforts to intensify diplomatic efforts, because if we were to hope for unimpeded access to all of Ukraine, the solution to that lies elsewhere than in the field.
And thank you. And I want to get back to you after this. We go around about sort of the future of humanitarian corridors and what it might look like, or what it could look like. So thank you so much. I'll ask Katya, who's online with us, to give us some opening remarks as well, and again to sort of address the issues around progress for humanitarian access to corridors, particularly in your organization and what you've seen. So please take the floor.
Sure, thank you so much. I just came back a few hours ago from field visits to several regions, including newly accessible areas in Kherson. And I'm speaking from a place where my job is to make the day-to-day to the programming happen. And so I think that Mans has given a really excellent overview of what is happening in the big picture in Ukraine. And I can give more specific examples from 3 days of direct observations, conversations with displaced people. So my remarks will be grounded in this experience more than what's discussed in the halls of power or at the very strategic level. In terms of has there been progress in opening corridors in eastern and southern Ukraine? As far as areas under occupation, I have not heard of any regular corridor other than those that Mans mentioned, but again, they are very sporadic and insecure. So there have been many of the IDPs that we served, they did come through corridors at great risk to themselves early on through not necessarily organized corridors, but more informal networks, often operating with usually small actors, local actors on the ground, without much support from the international community, because there is such a fear of risk transference and a reluctance to provide support to organizations or people or volunteers who are putting themselves at risk. IDPs who still have family behind under occupation discuss potentially trying to visit people only through going through Russia, through the other end, either through Georgia or through Russia. However, most are too terrified to even consider visiting family members who are still there. The only way to operate in non-government controlled areas that I have seen, experienced, that some of our partners, our local partners, are able to do is if you have a pre-existing presence. And those who do have a pre-existing presence in those areas can only do very limited programming. non-food items, maybe a little bit of repairs, maybe some cash assistance. But programming has to be extremely limited because, and I hope to talk about this later, but because a lot of the programming in the humanitarian world, in many ways, is anathema to the kinds of values that we find in more authoritarian regimes. So the very programming that exists in the humanitarian space, either women and girls empowerment or mental health, is not something that would be welcomed by the Russian Federation. In terms of what we have been able to do, with our partners, we can do some very limited cash programming, but the barriers are significant to that, and the kinds of people you can reach are limited to those who had a pre-existing Ukrainian bank and can still use that bank card to access money. And that has to do with legalities coming from the Ukrainian government in terms of money being transferred into the Russian Federation. Other barriers, not just to corridors, but to providing aid inside occupied territories through Russia, are in many ways the Russian Federation is not interested in Western aid in occupied Ukraine, and that a lot of that has to do with some of the great power discussions, as well as what I mentioned around some of the programming not really being in line with their agenda. And another area is security. There is a huge fear among INGOs about reputational risk, liabilities in the realm of security. So even even for NGOs who do have access or pre-existing presence with authority to operate in occupied areas of Ukraine, they are most likely to work with people who are already on the ground there, and not necessarily to send anybody into those areas from other access points. And yeah, finally, I mean, one thing to consider in terms of humanitarian corridors, why is there a block? What are some of the problems? I think we have to think about the bigger picture goal for Russia in Ukraine is the biggest threat to Russia's long-term occupation of Ukraine are Ukrainian civilians, people who consider themselves Ukrainian. And so if one of Russia's goals, one of the government's goals, is to eliminate that nationhood, those civilians, if we've seen civilians are directly targeted, it makes very little sense to have a corridor if you're trying to eliminate a nation. So that's, I think, the biggest barrier is really that the goals of the Russian Federation are not aligned with creating a corridor.
Thank you. You know, that's an excellent point that I want to get back to, as well as this issue of sort of the risk transference between international INGOs and into local organizations. I want to get back to you on that one as well. But thank you for your remarks. This is really helpful to have this local perspective and what you're seeing on the ground. So this is fantastic. And Johnny, so again, love to get your comments for starters and summarize kind of some of your areas. We'll come back to you with additional questions. But again, your sort of sense of what's going on and what the future of aid corridors look like and some of those barriers.
Great, thank you. And you know, just like a lot of us in the room, I'll start off that this isn't an official view as a contractor at the Naval War College. It's very much my own views through my own research and in my own time. And so with that caveat out the way, I think it's good when we talk about humanitarian corridors. And from the perspective I'm going to bring from the Russia perspective. So a lot of my research looks at Russia policy, doctrine, actions in the humanitarian space. I've been researching this since 2018, first in Syria and then also in Ukraine as well. And I think it's good to step back and remind ourselves how Russia conceives of the notion humanitarian, because it's different. And I think this is quite a large barrier to that misalignment that Katya was talking about. You know, their policies don't talk about saving lives, alleviating suffering, doing principled aid. At most, they talk about alleviating poverty and addressing the consequences of disaster, whatever that means. And so, you know, when you start looking at that and delving down a bit more into the commentary by different military commentators, And that's important because the vast majority of aid provided by the Russian state is through the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine, in Syria, and in various places around the world. So, what they say matters. And so while you start seeing the commentary, they talk about really that humanitarian aid is part of hybrid warfare. It's a tool that Russia can use to undermine its adversaries. And it can also use this as a tool to advance its own national security objectives, foreign policy tools. And so when you start thinking about that and understanding that, when you look at humanitarian corridors, they're not used for saving lives, alleviating suffering. They're used as a political tool to further Russia's goals. And so if you start looking at humanitarian corridors, not just in Ukraine, but Syria before that, in the 10 years before that, you really see that Russia uses them as a tool when it's convenient for them. Think the siege of Aleppo, think when they were taking over eastern Ghouta, think when they were taking over southern Syria. They use these humanitarian corridors as tools to basically say to the opposition, you're losing, get out of there. And so I think that, it highlights the use of that tool by Russia in that hybrid warfare aspect. And then I think also in addition to that, when you see Russia's humanitarian ecosystem, which I've looked at, there's a lack of centralization. And so, in Syria, for example, aid was largely delivered by military police forces. In Nagorno-Karabakh, it was a motorized division. In Ukraine, it's several different military units from around Russia. And so if you're trying to negotiate kind of access and humanitarian corridors, you're having to start from scratch in each of those contexts over time. And so with all that in mind, unfortunately, I'm quite cynical about Russia's are they wanting to maintain these humanitarian corridors? And I think for me, the answer is as long as it's in their interest and they get some objective out of it. And then just to finish, and I'm sure we'll explore this more, a lot of my research focuses on Russian aid deliveries by the Russian humanitarian ecosystem that I've been tracking in Ukraine and also other places. And so there's about 17 non-state Russian NGOs that often have quite a strong state alignment or masked state alignment that have delivered aid in the last year to Ukraine, in addition to 7 kind of state entities as well. And they've delivered over 4,000 times to over 300 communities. So this is quite a notable ecosystem that often is isolated from the wider response. But I'll stop there, and I'm happy to kind of delve down into anything I've said in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you for all of your remarks so far. And actually, I'll just, because we're talking about this particular issue, it seemed interesting to me that because Russian motives around creating corridors for humanitarian access of their own are linked to motives, I imagine that would also, their perception of humanitarian corridors from the West would be the same, right? In other words, could you comment on sort of the hesitation that Russian forces would give any access in order to advance, as Katja said, the idea that, it reinforces the West's participation?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly I think the distrust that, Western aid agencies are intelligence agents hiding in plain sight, that they're trying to collect information, they're spreading ideas that undermine Russia's strength in the areas it's occupying, and things like that. And so, I think those kind of aspects really highlight, the fragility of Russia's view towards humanitarian aid, because they're very much threatened by it. And so this is also a challenge to overcome with Russia's fear over engaging with the wider community. And you've seen that in Syria as well, and other places. So
really interesting. And Katja, back to you on the issue. You had mentioned this. The largely local response to any sort of access. In other words, the kind of the informal, and Mans mentioned this as well, the informal access corridors, which really take kind of a local perspective. How do you think those can be either supported by the international community? You mentioned this issue of risk transference and the fear of that. Could you comment further on that particular issue?
Sure. So there are corridors and there are evacuations, and I do want to make a clear distinction between the two. The corridors that are informal, I think they're extremely dangerous, even for those who are trying to escape. And so that's an area that I'm not sure the international community would want to touch. And I don't want to touch on that one because it's a big one, and there's another one that we actually can, I think, that we should evaluate some more, which is evacuations. Evacuations tend to happen with local actors. People are motivated to help out of no payment, they're not working for anyone. They just cannot stand what's happening. So whether it's NGOs or just private citizens who raise some money to buy a vehicle, evacuations happen primarily by local actors with not a lot of funding from the INGOs. And I'll start with a little bit of a story about how there's a mismatch in what INGOs and what the international community is looking for and what the local actors are trying to achieve. For the international community, for international donors to give money to support evacuations, they're going to want to provide as much support for the security of the people who are doing the evacuations as well as those who are being evacuated. This means personal protective equipment. This means fortified vehicles, things that can withstand mines or attacks, etc. And that all seems like a really great idea. And yet some of the best intentions sometimes don't have the results that we're looking for. So for instance, one local NGO did get some support from international donors, and they put all these measures in place. And when they completed their work, they said, please don't ever give us any of those armored cars again. They're too slow. We cannot run away with a vehicle that's so slow. It's too heavy to be fast. So there's a real fear of providing support to local actors without also requiring a very strong security apparatus around it. And that, I think that goes back to what I would consider, from my understanding of the history with humanitarian actors, is that 30 years ago, there was no security. 20 years ago, maybe a little bit, but not that much. And eventually this became something that was a problem for the humanitarian community. And there may have been, in some ways, a strong reaction that humanitarian actors are still dealing with in terms of actually being able to get access to areas. Many INGOs will not even allow their personnel outside of, for instance, the city of Dnipro, because their insurance does not allow them to leave. This creates a real barrier to people doing their work, either by supporting local actors with funding, or by the international community being able to access those areas themselves to see what needs to be done.
Thank you. Yeah, super interesting. And you brought up a point and the distinction between negotiated access for humanitarian aid delivery and then negotiations around evacuations and allowing evacuations too. And Mens, I wondered if you would comment on, given the NGO working group to look at access and to call for access, both the support of refugees, et cetera, but also in humanitarian corridors. Could you talk about that distinction and the sort of prospects of negotiation around access for aid corridors versus evacuation?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question, actually, because the international community has not been at the forefront of the evacuations. It is a local response in every sense of the matter. It is a whole of society response. And those actors that we see now being involved in the evacuations are people that have that sense of duty, that have a completely different risk appetite than others. It's difficult to match. And so it's a very challenging issue in terms of working and being part of and supporting such effort, and meanwhile not transferring risk. And so I think there's a hesitation in being too involved in the evacuation because we simply do not want to place that burden, and it's counterintuitive, but that's what's happening. So instead, we're looking at the other types of access availability that we can utilize, which is also in a highly challenging and complicated and dangerous environments along the front line. We typically kind of look at a spectrum of 40 to 10 plus kilometers from the front line when things are starting to get a little bit more difficult, because you have these different types of long-range weapon systems that you have to navigate and have to take into account. And the closer to the front lines you are, the more high intensity naturally it is. And these particular evacuations, they happen oftentimes in the middle of a hotspot. There is actual fighting going on around you, because we're talking about civilians who, have they not already left now a year plus into the conflict? They're really only choosing to leave once the artillery is starting to hit their own building, basically. And so to take that leap and be part of that effort to get people out, it's a difficult task, and it's not something like that the sort of traditional humanitarian sector is used to.
That's a really interesting point, and I'd like to explore that a little further. And Katja, maybe you can comment too. The issue of localization. I mean, you work, and you're working on the ground and looking at organizations and empowering organizations that do very local activities, right? Outreach to women and to girls and to local empowerment. Given the risk that we talked about, what is the role of the international community? I mean, there's been significant criticism that the dollars and the resources that have been placed in this Ukraine response have not gotten to field organizations that are Ukrainian organizations that are doing the work. How should we do it? And how can we do it a little bit better? And then I'll turn to you gentlemen as well to ask you that.
A lot easier to talk about the problems than define the solutions. Ultimately, I mean, it comes down to this: when there's a response of this size, the big donors want to move a lot of money. So they move them through a big consortium. The big consortium moves it through INGOs, and then the INGOs look for local partners. But they also have a lot of money to move. So they're looking for the most equipped local partners, the largest ones. So this is a distinction for HIAS. While we have a local partner that we've helped establish in 2013. HIAS had been in Ukraine since 2011. Big success story. It's one of the biggest local organizations here called Right to Protection. We are also now working with very small actors where I need to walk them through what an indirect cost rate means. I mean, we're talking about, I come from a consulting background, so I think this is a great opportunity to actually be working side by side with the local partners and teaching them this is how you access bigger and bigger trenches of funding. But it is not aligned with both the requirements of donors, the reporting, the accountability, everything that's required, the list of policies required to give money to local actors with the requirements from the international community, international donors. It is so burdensome for a partner. Most of our partners that are small, we're doing smaller grants, we're working really closely with them. And I mean, we're talking about they have 10 employees or 30 employees, lots of volunteers, some contractors. These are really tiny organizations, but they're the ones who are doing the biggest work. So I think the easiest solution is to have very different levels of diligence, of requirements, of vetting for different funding amounts. So one solution that we have found is to do very small grants of $10,000, which I say very small, but of course the organizations here say, no, that's not small at all. To women-run organizations through an open call for them to submit proposals. And it's going to be very light touch in terms of all of the the rigor and the diligence because it's a smaller amount of money, so we're willing to take the risk. So some level of more of a, not exactly crowdsourcing, but much smaller amounts of money open to larger amounts of organizations, and accepting that there will be some risk, there will be some corruption, there will be some loss out of that. But when you look at the amount of money that goes to the overhead for INGOs, and you, at some point you have to ask, where is your appetite for accepting inefficiency, for accepting bureaucracy, accepting corruption, or not knowing where the money went? It's a very difficult question to really consider, because I think when we are reluctant to give smaller organizations money because they can't do all the accountability and all the reporting and all the financial everything tied up perfectly as it's supposed to be, what we're doing instead is channeling that money to higher paid individuals, expats, to be doing that work at a really big scale with INGOs, and just a tiny bit of money trickling down to the smaller organizations. So I'll stop right there.
Well,
I could write it better and more clearly.
No, it's a great point. It's the age-old question in localization, right? I mean, we talk about the emphasis that we need to empower local organizations and make sure that they have capabilities, move money directly to them. But we're also, it is always the issue of how do you contemplate corruption, and how do you contemplate accountability, and also, judge that based on or compared to really, supporting the big international agencies, right? So I think that's a challenge in, virtually every relief setting that we have today. Johnny, I want to get back to you about the issue of given this localization agenda that we're talking about, and given the importance of really local work that's being done on the ground in the Ukraine side, how does that get through, or does it ever get through to the Russian side? And is there some sort of a civil society response there in areas that we don't get to see?
Yeah, it's certainly, just hearing about the localization today, from my research on Russia, Eastern Ukraine and Kherson and Crimea is not, it's local to Russia, it's Russia. So, with Russian entities from, Moscow and other places going to Kherson and Donetsk and other places, they view it as they're going to Russia.
Sure.
And so the factor of localization doesn't factor in. Obviously I don't think it's Russia, it's sovereign, it's Ukraine, and this is very much my own opinions, but it's, I think kind of that factor doesn't play in Russia. And then when you start looking at the NGO community, as it were, there's about 17 NGOs that Russia has established, often with very close state links. The vast majority of them deliver aid through 50 or so humanitarian aid centers that have been set up by the United Russia Party, which is obviously Putin supporting kind of party.
Yeah.
And so it really tightens that state control over aid delivery in eastern Ukraine and other places, in occupied parts of Ukraine. And so, with that, there are kind of local organizations, mainly in Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, that support and link up with some of these Russia entities, as it were. But it's the vast majority of Russian entities coming in from outside into eastern Ukraine. So, slightly different perspective there from perhaps we would appreciate with localization.
Yeah, it's super interesting though, because we don't get much visibility into that at all, so it's actually so interesting. Mans, I want to ask you kind of to get back to one of our original points, and that is the future of access and the future of aid corridors for the provision of aid in areas that we need to get that are contested. What can be done? I'm sure that's a big question, sorry. But in other words, we talked about like the NGO consortium calling for greater access. We have civilian organizations that cry for better access. From the diplomatic front, how does that impact the diplomatic front, and how will it ever change the sort of permissiveness of humanitarian access in those areas? Maybe you can comment on that. And then what I will do is turn this over to the audience so you can all get ready for your questions in a second. But maybe you can sort of tell us a little bit about your thoughts of the future.
Yeah, I'm I'm an operational person. I'm a humanitarian, and there are obvious geopolitical ramifications for all of this. But from my perspective in the field, I think that we've done a substantial job to catch up with the local responders in Ukraine. I say we as the whole sort of international community in Ukraine, to various degrees, are responding along the front lines. We are responding in the most sort of access constraints environments, which happens to be, in the case of Ukraine, very much related to security, or at least in the Ukraine government-controlled parts. So, as I said, this sort of 50, 40 kilometer, 10 plus to the front line is a completely new space for any of us to operate within. It's not so much about the proximity exactly from the front line, because the front line is very fluid and it's very dynamic and it keeps changing, and it depends on also the mood of the day and the particular location. But to operate on a front line like that is extremely complicated, and it has taken a little time for the international response to get off the ground, but I think we're doing an increasingly important job working alongside our local partners, basically. In the case of NRC, and every organization has a different approach, we're very adamant of by principle, not doing risk transfer. We do want to work in the same locations as our partners. We do want to work alongside with our partners. We want to be engaged, involved, and address solutions as they occur in the environment in which these kind of things unfold. So just kind of going back to perhaps responsible partnership and what that means for different organizations and risk transfer and so on. I think that there's more to be done, but there's a important recognition that it's more than providing PPEs. It's more than providing fuel for vehicles and so on. Yeah. So I think that's the space we're exploring, which effectively kind of opens up the access in sort of that dynamic, at least. And it's not just about access, not just about security and risk transfer. It's also about how we operate alongside each other from a sort of principled point of view, having a very different foundation, sort of principled foundation. We as NRC, we as the most international humanitarian actors, we abide to a certain set of principles that our local counterparts explicitly reject. And we have to reconcile that somehow. We do not approach that as sort of, all you need is a training on humanitarian principles and that will fix the problem. No, it's not happening. We have to live with the fact that these are two sort of opposing world realities that has to reconcile, and the best way we could do that is to build a kind of close, intimate relationships with one another and enable that kind of deep understanding, and from that point be able to sort of draw certain red lines or agree on certain acceptable parameters and so on. And I think that's kind of part of the access enabling work, not in terms of physical space, but in terms of enabling principled action that inevitably, hopefully, will lead to more access in the long run.
And I want to ask a self-interested question, actually, because HHI and NRC and several of our colleagues have really invested a lot in training in negotiated access, in other words, humanitarian negotiation, and because there's sort of national and subnational negotiation, but a lot of access is on the ground right there. Do you find that training and the ability to actually educate people who are on the front lines negotiating day-to-day access points to be useful?
No.
Interesting.
I'll tell you why. And it's not that it's a blanket no. It's, in fact, what we've done with NRC is to contextualize those humanitarian negotiations trainings that has been referred to by Jan and elsewhere in the room. In fact, we had an exchange, a workshop that we banner as a learning exchange for frontline local responders. We had one last week And it's a sort of a series of events that we hope to continue having, where we basically just facilitate a space and exchange amongst local frontline responders specifically, to touch on some of these issues, to talk about risk, to talk about how we manage those, to talk about how principles and the differences and how we operationalize that in an acceptable manner. And most importantly, the sort of exchange that happens amongst themselves, because there are, I don't even dare to say a number, but there are many that type of small organizations that work along this very, very long front line. And so they will have very different experiences and have lots to learn from each other as well.
And Katja, do you find that as well? You're working with really local organizations in a variety of areas that are going to touch the front lines and require, like individuals who understand how to gain access of the day, right? In other words, to move programs into position. Do you find that the organizations that you're working with are sort of savvy about gaining access, or is that even a relevant question?
I have very strong opinions about this, and I will say that these are my own. These are not my organization's opinions. In this context, I'm only speaking about this context. Often you are working with organizations who either already have a local on the ground from the context that we're talking about, or are going to hire a team of people who have been living in that area, in that village, in that city, who may not be savvy about in the way that we want them to be savvy about all the risks. And specifically, we're talking about risks of whether it's shelling or mines or unexploded ordnances. These are the biggest risks to access in the newly accessible areas. So to me, when you are hiring a local team that has actually been living, for instance, in Kharkiv the entire time, to stop programming before creating a training opportunity for them because of the fear of risk and risk transference, to me, that doesn't make sense. However, it's great to start providing that training to increase their savvy. They're very grateful for it. 100%. There's openness. Everybody wants, the Ukrainians love training. So you put them in a room for training, they're going to be pretty excited about it. So absolutely, I fully support increasing the level of savvy. But to me, it's really criminal to stop programming when it is to be done with local actors on the ground who are living in that place, whether or not you can do that program.
That's really interesting because we have in our organization, we have a pretty extensive program with IMC to train both local and medical providers in, kind of trauma care, right? So and as you say, they love training and everybody wants to engage in that training and we think it's a good investment. However, there's the opportunity cost, right? When you're pulling people away from their duties to do so. So that's a really interesting point. Thank you. So we're at time to actually get the comments from the audience, and I'm sure you have dozens of questions actually for our panelists, and I'll take the studio audience here for the moment, and then we'll figure out how we can get people online as well. But if you've got a question, please raise it, and you can point it to one of the panelists, or I can point it for you. And don't be shy. There we go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Juliana Rubio. I'm the program manager of the Americas program here at CSIS. And my question is about the aid that Ukraine is receiving. How can we still justify that Ukraine is getting a lot of this aid while a lot of other countries have gone through, as we've mentioned, all of these issues throughout their history. So, how can we continue the support while also not leaving behind all of those others that need assistance?
That is a wonderful question. First of all, thank you for keeping to the rules of questions, which is announcing your name, your organization, and making a statement followed by a question mark, which is actually terrific, so thank you. And to that, I'll start actually by saying I would 100% agree that we have the moral imperative to really look at the Ukrainian response in the global context, because indeed we have suffering in an epic proportion around the Sahel and drought-affected areas throughout Central and North Africa and all around the world. And so we have really major responses that we have to fund. And so how can we justify this? The answer was probably the only way we can justify this is making sure that we fund other efforts with the vigor and the responsiveness that they need as well. But that's naive. And so maybe we can get commentary. Mans, you want to take a little stab at that, and maybe Katya as well. Like, in response to that, what do you say? The resources that are going to Ukraine, do they really pull away from? And I think we have to agree that they do pull away from both the attention and the financing of the other emergencies around the world. So, Mans, do you have a comment? Katya, how about you?
I'm happy to.
Sure. I mean, I think the longer term answer to that question for me is really about looking at reforming the humanitarian system so that every dollar is used better. So if we're to look at how much money was used in Ukraine well versus how much was used for various types of overheads and bureaucracies, keeping in mind that you do need to have accountability, you do need to have some systems in place. So much more could be done if with so much less money, if we actually looked at the system as a whole. That's sort of the bigger picture response. And then, of course, it's necessary to look at where, I mean, without doubt, aid is going to be dwindling to Ukraine. So the market for aid, if you will, and all the disasters that are happening, including Sudan right now, is going to take care of that. It's just going to diminish like it does in all conflicts.
Yep. Gentlemen, any one of you for additional thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a very difficult question, and I don't have any good answers, and I don't sort of, from a moral point of view, like to put a hierarchy on crises. I mean, and I'm not sure it's been established either that funding has sort of gone from other crises to fund Ukraine, and if that's the case, then I think we have a big problem. I think, besides the sort of hierarchy and the sort of global impartiality of that, I think that, for once, a humanitarian crisis has been appropriately funded. The Ukrainian crisis, for at least the first year, was finally appropriately funded. But of course, it should not come to the neglect of other crises. Sure. And I also think that it's one thing to talk about that now for the first year, but let's see how subsequent years is going to look like in terms of funding for Ukraine. So.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think it's the responsibility of the global humanitarian community to push for responsible spending across the board, and actually we have to make these what I think are not easy decisions because they often do come one at the expense of the other. So thank you. That was a great question, actually, and thanks for bringing that up. Other questions? Yeah, thank you. Right back there.
Hi, my name is Sarah Arthur with the Global Interagency Security Forum. You gave some really good anecdotes of partnerships, and I was just wondering, because you guys are kind of giving the INGO perspective, do you feel that the national or local NGOs feel that they are actually receiving all that they need? I think you gave a really good anecdote about the use of armored vehicles. So I'm wondering, from their vantage point, are they seeing the same thing?
Yeah, and it's so interesting question. And Katya, I'm going to ask you again on that one because you mentioned the notion of, unintended consequences and the perceptions of the support that we're giving and how it needs to be modified. Do you get the sense that local organizations are feeling it, are feeling the support, are feeling that they're getting the right assistance, or at least a reasonable shot at the right assistance?
think I speak for a lot of local organizations when I say I don't think so. I don't think that they feel that they're getting the support. One of the areas that's very frustrating for them is that every donor has different requirements. Every INGO operates differently. And so even when they do get funding, it comes with the enormous burden, of course, of recording things as needed according to different standards. It's difficult even for INGOs to follow all the rules and regulations of the donors. And I was at a localization conference with local NGOs a couple of weeks ago, and one of the points was, why can't y'all just have one type of system? Because if you did, then we'd learn it, and that's fine. But each time we partner with another organization, it becomes a whole nother learning effort. And I would question the value of that kind of capacity building. I think capacity building in terms of the big picture of accountability, capacity building in terms of sphere standards or other types of standards in terms of delivery of aid, that's fantastic. But capacity building about this is how this donor and this funder wants this kind of thing reported is to me a waste of time. But local organizations, it depends on which ones. The ones who have charismatic CEOs or directors, they get a lot of funding, they make things happen, but the smaller organizations tend to be left out, again, partly because they're not able to absorb as much cash as the INGOs want them to.
Thank you. Speaking of charismatic CEOs, former CEO of Concern is here, Dominic McSorley. And Dominic has worked with our organization, several others, to put forth the Building a Better Response program, which has really been intended to try to get local organizations kind of to understand the nomenclature of the humanitarian enterprise, which is actually really complicated and really difficult. And so, to your point, I think it's especially real time and in acute emergency, it's really hard to navigate those systems, and it makes great sense that this is a big challenge. Great. Yes, there's a question back there. And I'm encouraging you, please ask questions. These are actually really good ones. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kwesi Sonkulot. I'm from the World Food Programme. I've got a question, I guess, to the panel, but anyone can jump in. I think we're seeing, not only in Ukraine, but across a number of other conflict countries, a trend of conflict parties, but largely states, using humanitarian assistance either for political goals or denying humanitarian assistance outright. We're also seeing a trend of the vilification of humanitarian actors. So I'm wondering, are there any lessons learned or emerging lessons learned from Ukraine in terms of combating either of these two? Either of the use of aid as a weapon of war or on the vilification of humanitarian actors that would be useful for other states. I'm thinking about your Myanmars, your Ethiopias, your Sudans, other places where states are engaged in similar types of counterinsurgencies.
So like a tiny question then. Yeah, thank you. It's a terrific question, and it'll bring us probably to the end to talk about this, because it's actually really important, the idea of the changing nature of aid and the co-op, aid being co-opted for political purposes, and really controlled in a lot of areas as well. And Johnny, I'll have you take a stab at it, because I think that you'll have a really interesting perspective on the military side and what you've seen, and especially your comparative analysis in Syria, Yemen, and other places that have been, really have controlled aid in a way that has made it quite politicized. Do you want to take a stab?
Yeah, no big question. I think from my own research and perspective, when you see states like Russia use aid as a political tool to achieve objectives, it doesn't mind undermining principles and other norms that is seen in the humanitarian aid. It's very hard to go against that. My view is that since Chechnya in the 2000s, Russia has developed this over 20 years and has largely been left alone to a certain extent to do what it wants in this space. And I worry that because it's used to being isolated from the international community, its aid system is self-supported primarily by the Ministry of Defense. And actually, when you look at the NGO community as a whole in Russia, it's really exploded in the last kind of 10 years or so. I mean, if you look in 2011, there were 0 registered charity shops in Russia, 0. Now, when you think of, and you look at Russia and their response to Ukraine, there's lots of church groups, there's charity shops, there's local mayors, all providing aid to the occupied areas of Ukraine. And that's challenging because I think that from the powers that be, the decision makers from the Russian side, they're succeeding. This strategy is working. They're getting bigger. They're able to kind of go into more different contexts in Syria, in Ukraine, in Libya, and in other places, and survive and thrive in these environments. So I think until Russia sees kind of some kind of consequence for that, they're going to keep thinking they're doing a great job from their own perspective. So I'm afraid it's not a positive kind of lessons learned, unfortunately, but I think that's, it's good to recognize the problem as a start.
Well, and the co-opting of aid is age old, right?
Yeah.
It's from Biafra on, right? And so the use of aid as a diplomatic tool or as a tool of public opinion, or as withholding aid to controlled areas. I mean, it happens all around the world and in many contexts that we have it, that we have constrained access and armed actors. Mans, do you want to take another stab at just sort of what you see in the idea of use of aid as a tool for controlling communities? It's a huge question.
Yeah, I think, again, from the perspective of my field work, I probably wouldn't exceptionalize Ukraine. I think there's no difference what's playing out there than any of the other contexts that we've really, and perhaps even less so. NGOs have years of experience and exposure of highly politicized conflicts, and we understand the need to reach people where they are in an impartial way. I think there are nuances in how this plays out in the context of Ukraine. Again, sort of at the field, we do have to reconcile with the fact that we're working with and alongside actors who are explicitly political, basically. And that kind of manifests in different operational dilemmas that we have to navigate. And I think also, there are other people who can speak better on how these more strategic dilemmas plays out. And when things like humanitarian aid is announced alongside military aid from one country to Ukraine, then we have a problem, obviously. But I think it hasn't perhaps yet sort of manifested or crystallized quite yet in terms of the impact of that. But certainly it doesn't help the perception of us as neutral from the eyes of each of the parties to the conflict.
We can all argue and debate if there is such a thing as humanitarian neutrality anymore anyway, because of the sort of perceptions of aid and the sort of great erosion of the sense of neutrality, which has been ongoing for 20 years. So it's a great question, and thanks. And we could probably talk about that one all day, but we won't, because we're going to wrap up our panel today. And so I want to thank Katja for your really awesome work in the field, for being in the field, for the work you do, for especially your approach to looking at really challenging populations, marginalized populations, and those that can be forgotten. So really terrific insights you've shared with us that are very local and very palpable. Thank you. Mans, for your really wonderful sort of big systems approach and the way that you're looking at this, and how you've given us a perspective on humanitarian corridors and what that really looks like. It's really terrific. And Johnny, I think I've learned a ton already just from your perspective on the Russian side and what that might look like, and how those perceptions that we don't even really get to see or talk about much have really informed us a lot. So to our organizers at CSIS and NRC, thank you so much for this panel. Thank you all for hanging with us for this afternoon. Thanks to the panelists. And this discussion will continue tomorrow, I think 9 o'clock. And so I will just close the event today and invite you back tomorrow. And once again, thank you all for your participation. Thank you.